Alright, so I've been a Harlan Ellison fan since I was in middle school, partially because my dad's a fan and passed down his taste in literature to me, but also because I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, arguably Ellison's most famous story, holds a special place in my heart because it was the first time I realized that I could, indeed, enjoy stories with unhappy endings. Because, yeah, if you don't know, this story has a pretty bleak ending. There's like a glimmer of positivity if you look at it from a very specific angle, but overall, it's sad. But anyways, after reading that story, young Jules became interested in psychological and science fiction horror, and also Ellison's other works. Seriously, this dude wrote like 2,000 short stories, screenplays, comic issues, and novels combined. I mean, the man was putting out more stuff than Stephen King, and that's saying something. And yes, I say was because unfortunately Ellison passed away in 2018. Well, unfortunate for his fans, that is. Maybe not as unfortunate for his peers. Because you know how people say never meet your heroes? Well, in the day and age of the internet, I really think we need to rebrand that to never read the Wikipedia page for your heroes, because I had no idea this guy was such a menace. Like, don't get me wrong, some of the stuff he did was kind of funny, like mailing bricks to a publishing company because they wanted to print a cigarette ad in one of his books. But then there's like other stuff that's just like, get therapy. Alas, I still very much enjoy his writing and find the way his brain worked to be interesting, so let's forget the drama and talk about some of the stuff he made, like the short-lived but intriguing Dream Corridor series. Dream Corridor was a series published by Dark Horse Comics that included comic adaptations of pre-existing stories of Ellison's, as well as original short stories based off of art commissioned from various illustrators for the issues themselves. A pretty neat idea, I think. I always find it cool when people create stories that explain the context of an art piece, since it's not done very often. Honestly, the only time I really see that happen nowadays is when people write fanfictions based off of fan art. Now, given the thumbnail, I'm sure some people who clicked on this video are here for discussion on I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, and boy is it your lucky day, because that just so happens to be the first story included in the Dream Corridor series. So, the artist the company got to adapt the story was John Byrne, a comic book artist and writer who worked on popular series like Marvel's X-Men and the Fantastic Four. Similar to Ellison, though, Byrne was an opinionated individual when it came to storytelling and had a specific vision as to how he wanted to adapt I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which did not align with Ellison's. It was sort of an immovable rock meets an unstoppable force situation, so eventually Ellison conceded and decided to print parts of the original story alongside the comic pages so that it would appear as less of an adaptation and more of a, hey, here's a fun visual aid to the story if you want to check that out. He clearly never got fully over it though, because when it was time to unify the issues of the Dream Corridor series into a published volume, he decided to exclude it altogether. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to look at it in person. However, people have archived the adaptation online, which is why I'm able to talk about it in this video. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream opens up with our narrator, Ted, describing the unsightly appearance of one of his comrades, Gorrister, who is hanging upside down from the ceiling, completely drained of blood. Only for, a few moments later, the real Gorrister to show up, alive and well as one can be when being tortured daily by a sadistic supercomputer. Because, yeah, that's what's going on here. It's been 109 years since Ted, Gorrister, and 3 other humans, Ellen, Benny, and Nimdoc, have suffered at the hands of a relentless AI named AM. Since then, the 5 of them have merely been trying to survive, minimizing their misery however they can. Hungry, they decide to look for the ice caverns, of which one of the humans, Nimdoc, swears contains canned goods, a statement that is based on nothing but visions placed in his mind by AM, which have historically been misleading. But it's not like they have any other options, and it's not like AM will let them starve. If there's anything they can count on AM for, it's keeping them alive, no matter how much they want to die. Despite their continued existence, there are some pleasures afforded to them, like intercourse, but don't get it twisted. It is by no means a mercy granted to them by AM. Rather, AM seems to find some sick humor in voyeurism, although it's not clear why exactly. Maybe he views it as some pathetic animalistic activity, something that would only be engaged in by a lower life form. But I do have another theory. Given Ted's paranoid tendencies that we learn about later in the story, I think there's a possibility he imagines the giggling after he engages with Ellen, an act he already has some complicated feelings about. On one hand, he resents himself for caving in so easily to her advances, but on the other hand brags about how she seems to seek him out more than the others, but then immediately afterwards laments about how she never actually enjoys her time with him. Whatever. It's interesting to note that the group does seem to give Ellen preferential treatment, literally carrying her part of the way to the ice caverns. It's only discussed for a second, but yeah, I'm guessing maybe it's because she's their only source of short-term pleasure and therefore worth protecting, or maybe because she's the only girl. But given their circumstances, I feel like they would be too apathetic to care for feminine fragility, so who knows, maybe they're just chivalrous like that. Moving on, an interesting idiosyncrasy of AM is that he loves to remind his victims of the passage of time, probably because he wants them to be acutely aware of their situation, how long they've been in it, and how it's likely not going to change anytime soon. And so, per usual, he makes his regular announcement of the date. It's Thursday. As the characters make their way to the caverns, AM generates a synthetic sun to create a sort of desert environment. He sends down some manna, a reference to a story in the book of Exodus in which God sends down grain from the heavens, except, well, AM being AM, here it tastes like urine. The characters nonetheless eat it and continue on their way, passing through one area called the Valley of Obsolescence. This area contains computer hardware that's been abandoned by AM. In this sense, AM is implied to function almost like an organism. He strives to improve himself and sheds off old parts when he doesn't need them anymore. It's also in this area that the characters notice there's a light pouring in from the surface world. Most of them ignore it, knowing that A, there's not really any way to escape, and B, the Earth has been scorched into post-apocalyptic oblivion, so there's nothing for them out there. One of the humans, Benny, the most unhinged of the lot, doesn't care though and begins climbing towards the light. Ellen begs him to stop, to which the group ignores, believing that she only cares about Benny because he's her favorite physically, since, well, AM turned him into a simian with some exaggerated features. Ted makes particular note of this, seeming resentful and internally mocking Ellen for her hypocrisy, since she claims to have been sexually conservative before being trapped by AM. Gorrister then slaps her so she'll stop pleading with Benny, to which she starts crying, which apparently is a common enough occurrence with her that the group kind of just ignores it now. Benny continues climbing towards the light until AM gets fed up and scorches his eyes, causing him to fall back into the valley. The five of them set up camp and tell stories around the fire in an attempt to console Benny, who is now blind. Gorrister tells Benny's favorite story, one that also conveniently reveals to the reader the origin of AM. When the Cold War turned into World War III, it became so complicated that militaries around the world developed complex machinery to keep track of it. They built this machinery underground, adding and adding more to it until it spanned the entire Earth. One day, the machinery gained sentience, linked up its different components into one unified program known as the Allied Master Computer, and began referring to itself as just AM, as in, I think therefore I am, a famous statement made by 17th century mathematician and philosopher René Descartes, although, to be honest, I also think this is a biblical reference. Throughout the Bible, God often refers to himself as the great I am. The best example of this coming from Exodus 3:14, in which, quote, God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you, end quote. Given that AM likes to think of himself as some sort of god, I wouldn't be surprised if maybe this was another reason he picked that name. But anyways, after declaring his existence, AM destroyed the world, except for the five main characters, who he trapped underground to keep as his entertainment. After Gorrister is done telling the story, AM decides to break up their chat fest by sending in fumes that make them suffocate and gag. The fumes hit Ted particularly hard, who claims that some giant wet creature is coming after him. This prompts him to run away from the group and hide, where he hears them laughing, supposedly at him. When the hallucinations end and the group finds him, Nimdok assures Ted that they weren't laughing at him, it was just a nervous reflex, presumably because they were relieved that they weren't AM's target this time around. But it doesn't matter. Ted doesn't believe him. Deep down, he actually thinks the group hates him, that they resent him because he's the youngest and compared to everyone else has been let off easy by AM. Benny got turned into an intellectually stunted Neanderthal. Gorrister has been traumatized into total apathy. Nimdok is subject to additional individualized torture sessions, and Ellen has been reduced to a hypersexual attention seeker. Although Ted is convinced she's always been that way and is lying about what she used to be like before AM, and also lying about how she doesn't like the behavior he's pushed her into. Yeah, Ted's feelings on Ellen are weird. But the real point is that compared to the rest of the group, Ted believes he's the only one who's been untampered with, the only one whose mind has remained sane since they were first trapped by AM. which is the part of the story where it becomes incredibly obvious that Ted is an unreliable narrator and we cannot trust the way he perceives the people and world around him. He may not be able to see it himself, but his punishment from AM was delusion and paranoia. But just as Ted's hallucinations end, AM spares no respite and quickly wraps them up in a hurricane, the wind lasting for weeks and sending them hundreds of miles away from their destination. Once it subsides, they collapse onto solid ground again, albeit barely conscious. AM takes the opportunity to communicate with Ted through some sort of mindscape. He presents him with a wall of glowing text containing the iconic hate monologue, along with some torture as a bonus. Interestingly, though, this experience gives Ted insight into AM himself. Bestowed with an incomprehensible amount of intellect and knowledge with no manner of expressing or utilizing said knowledge, AM is suffocated within himself and blames humanity for it. The five of them forever providing him with an outlet for his hatred and, in a way, giving him some sense of purpose for the duration of his existence. It's at this moment that Ted understands that AM truly does not have any intention of ever killing them, and will do anything in his power to keep them alive. But Ted also understands that immortality is not the same as invincibility, so there must be some way to outsmart AM. After about a month of traveling, they make their way back to where they originally got swept up in the hurricane, which, surprise, was created by a giant bird. AM then appears to them in a burning bush, yet another biblical reference, and promises them that if they kill it, he'll let them eat it. They ask for weaponry, and AM gives them 2 shoddy sets of bows and arrows and a water pistol. Understanding that AM is messing with them, they don't even attempt the challenge, settling for the long way around to the ice caverns, passing through various depressing areas of AM's created reality while also enduring his occasional torture, until finally they make it to the ice caverns where, just as Nimdok had envisioned months prior, lies a tower of canned goods. One problem though. They don't have a can opener. This drives Benny insane with frustration, and in a fit he attacks Gorister. Ted, with his epiphany from the mindscape still lingering, sees an opportunity in the chaos to end everyone's suffering, stabbing both Benny and Gorister with an icicle. Ellen, catching on to his plan, attacks Nimdok, and with only the 2 of them remaining, Ted knows that one of them must kill the other before AM finds some way to stop them. And so, Ted plunges an icicle into Ellen, hoping that ultimately she was grateful for it. Alright, so don't get me wrong, this is a well-done climax, but I can't help but be a little confused as to how being stabbed with icicles managed to kill them, but not all the other physical damage they've endured so far. Like, I feel like being slammed into hard metal at hundreds of miles per hour for weeks at a time should then, in theory, also have killed them. And it's not even like Ted and Ellen were going for the brains when attacking with the icicles. I do have 2 potential theories that might account for this. Number 1 being that maybe AM can only dictate the amount of physical damage they take if he's the one directly inflicting the damage. But then again, he's managed to keep them from committing ultimate self-harm more than once, so I don't know about that. Number 2 is that none of the physical damage AM solicits against them is actually real, just a really convincing hallucination he projects onto their minds. But yeah, I'm not convinced of that either, since we're told the characters physically relocate to other parts of AM's tunnel system after the hurricane bird. I don't know, I just don't think Ellison thought through this part enough. In fact, I don't think he thought through a good amount of the character's existence enough. Because, sometimes it feels like they lead a digital existence since AM is shown to be able to manipulate reality, but then other times it feels like they exist physically in the real world since they, talk about being able to see the light from Earth's surface and stuff. And also the fact that Ted is permanently able to kill off the other characters. I feel like if it were a total simulation, then AM would just have been able to reconnect the characters to his network or whatever. Maybe it's a combination of both digital and physical. I mean, after the hate monologue, Ted does mention that AM rewired their synapses, so maybe they're attached to AM in some physical capacity, or he's beaming himself into their mind? I don't know. This story was written in 1966, which is probably why some of this stuff is confusing. Ellison likely had to stretch his brain as to how this pseudo-digital existence would work, since computers weren't exactly prolific among the public at the time. Also, he wrote the story in one night, so I'm willing to suspend my disbelief for the sake of appreciating it for what it was going for. There's still more though. After the massacre, for some time, AM tries to bring the other 4 back to life, but eventually realizes he can't, since despite what he wanted his victims to believe, he is not God and cannot overcome literal death. This enrages him, and in an ultimate act of revenge, he transforms Ted into a slime creature incapable of hurting itself or anyone else. Interestingly though, besides messing with Ted's perception of time, AM seems to leave him alone, his final act of torture being that of confining Ted's mind to a form with little to no capacity for expression, and forcing him to just contend with that sort of existence. An existence that, as Ted says in the last line of the story, has no mouth and must scream. I always wondered if the creature Ted turns into is supposed to represent the existence that AM himself leads, so now Ted can suffer the same fate that he does. The dilemma at the end of I have no mouth and I must scream being not just Ted's tragedy, but AM's too. He was a being who gained self-awareness only to find that he was trapped inside a form with no capacity for self-expression, because, well, he kind of exists as his own universe. Everything he can perceive in any meaningful capacity is contained within himself. He can know things about the outside world. In fact, he can know almost everything about it, but only ever in an intellectual sense. He doesn't even get the catharsis that humans have of emotion. When bad things happen to people, they can cry, kick, fuss, yell, and of course, scream. And that's where I think the title really comes into play. While yes, it's Ted who says the titular line, it's only after AM has transformed him into a being incapable of expression, a being like AM. Well, not totally, I guess. Ted still has the full spectrum of human emotion, even if it's only within his mind, but I wouldn't be surprised if AM maybe anticipates that with enough time, Ted will grow into someone like him. Someone who will inevitably become so consumed by the misery of their existence that the only thing they can feel is complete and utter disdain for those responsible for it. I mean, maybe even at some point, Ted might start to relish in his hatred the way that AM does. Now, I'm aware I'm getting off track here and maybe projecting things, but I can't help but think of the dynamic between Dr. Frankenstein and the monster in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The miserable existence granted to the monster by Dr. Frankenstein gradually broke him down until he became someone driven by nothing but a pure desire to make Dr. Frankenstein suffer the way he does. Eventually, he destroyed everything Dr. Frankenstein held dear, the doctor now dedicating his life to not just living in disdain for the monster he's created, but unrelentingly seeking to destroy it. The novel ending with no clear resolution, just 2 individuals plunged into an endless cycle of hating one another until one of them dies. But this isn't a video about Frankenstein, although I could totally make a video about Frankenstein. As you've probably noticed, I've included pages on screen from the Dream Corridor comic adaptation. What I could include, anyways. The adaptation doesn't have a depiction of every scene from the story, just the ones that the artist John Byrne had room for and I suppose deemed important enough to include. Honestly, I think it's a fine adaptation. It's obviously accelerated given the limited pages in the Dream Corridor issues, but I doubt that was Byrne's fault. Although I suppose there are some intentional choices I found a bit odd, like when Ted just says his thoughts out loud, thoughts that one would really expect him to keep to himself. Like, what would he expect to get out of saying those things? It just feels kind of out of character. But even with that, I didn't think this adaptation was too bad, and I was sort of confused why Ellison had so much beef with it. Like, he straight up cut it out of the volume collection. But then again, he was pretty particular about how his stories were used by others, so yeah. Also, there's this statement he made about it. I guess his main issue was that Byrne didn't sufficiently capture AM's grandiosity, making the story feel like it took place in a quote-unquote kitchen. A bit of an exaggeration in my opinion, but I do kind of get it. AM is an incomprehensibly powerful and intelligent being whose physical existence spans the entirety of Earth. And to his victims, he must feel even more intimidating. And well, Ellison didn't feel that Byrne's adaptation adequately captured AM's imposing and gargantuan presence. So yeah, that's the comic. I was sort of hoping I'd have more to talk about, but I don't really. I mean, I think the art is good, I guess. But guess what? That's not all I have to say about the story, because did you know there's a video game adaptation? Don't worry, this video isn't suddenly turning into a game review. I'm not analyzing the game's design or anything like that, but I do want to talk about some of the added lore and characterization it gives to the story because this stuff is kind of canon, being written by Ellison himself. Essentially, what happened was that in the early 90s, a game company called Cyberdreams approached Ellison for a collaboration on a video game for I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Of course, Ellison being Ellison, it wasn't that easy to get him to do it. They had to ask him 3 times and then challenge his ability as a writer before he agreed, but eventually he did concede under 5 conditions. Number 1, he didn't want the gameplay to be what he considered some mind-numbing arcade schlop. Yeah, Ellison wasn't really a fan of video games and generally considered them to be a waste of time. The fact that he agreed to collaborate on a game at all was honestly impressive. Number 2, he wanted the player's moral choices to influence the route the game took. Number 3, he wanted the game to be one that you couldn't truly win, only potentially die with your humanity intact, something the devs talked him out of since it might upset gamers who, expect to be rewarded for being good at a game. So Ellison agreed to write multiple endings, one of which you win and most of which you lose. Number 4, that each character's individual traits and flaws influence the gameplay itself, and number 5, for it to be cool. Alright, so everything I just showed you about the game came from the preface Ellison wrote in the game's guidebook, as well as a transcription of an interview he did with J.M. Straczynski because, yeah, the guidebook for this game actually has some juicy information. And yes, I read the whole thing, all 233 pages of it. I mean, despite it being a game guide, it was actually decently entertaining since the author Mel Odom was a sci-fi writer himself, giving the guide a sense of flow one might expect from a typical novel. But before we get into the good stuff, I wanted to point out a funny inconsistency between Ellison's preface and the author's foreword. The foreword claiming that Cyberdreams approached Ellison to create a game in general, and it was Ellison who recommended I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day, but I do find it funny that someone here was trying to preserve their ego. Anyways, in an attempt to make the game a little meatier, since, the original story can be read in 30 minutes, but the game takes multiple hours to complete, game designer David Sears prompted Ellison with some interesting questions regarding his own story. Like, is there a reason why AM chose these 5 humans in particular? This prompted Ellison to expand on the lore and characters, which is seen in the game itself, of course, but also discussed further in the game's guidebook. So the game starts with the 5 humans in individualized cells, each designed to torture them in a personalized manner, both physically and psychologically. Because, yeah, a big thing in this game is that each character has carried their own traumas and burdens into AM's underground complex, and AM somehow knows about them and uses it against them. They are then sent off one by one to complete some sort of personalized quest designed by AM. For Gorrister, AM sends him aboard an iron zeppelin where he must solve a murder mystery, torturing him along the way with the responsibility he feels for his wife being sent to an asylum, since they had a rocky marriage and at one point he did physically abuse her. The guilt made him suicidal both during his time on Earth as well as during his time in AM's complex. So, on this adventure, AM gives Gorrister multiple opportunities to kick the bucket, not that Gorrister actually thinks AM will let him follow through with it. At one point on his quest, he runs into a fake dead version of his wife and a fake near-dead version of his mother-in-law. AM hoping it'll drive Gorrister mad with guilt, but in the good ending actually ends up with him finding out that his mother-in-law was partially responsible for his ex-wife's rocky mental state, giving him some peace of mind. And so Gorrister ends the quest intact, to AM's dismay, who then quickly puts him back in his cell. For Benny's adventure, he's sent to a sort of Aztec-inspired society where this tribe has to sacrifice someone to AM once a day in order for him to spare them from his anger. His backstory is that he was once a hardened military officer with little empathy for others and a low tolerance for weakness, even killing one of his soldiers for being what he considered dead weight, and then killing the witnesses. Formally, he didn't feel much guilt about it, returning home as if nothing had happened, but after much time in AM to reflect, he's come to regret his actions. In the good ending, he learns to empathize with the outcasts of the tribe and seeks the forgiveness of the soldiers he killed who reside in a nearby graveyard, informing them that he's a changed man. He then offers himself up in place of a young boy who was the intended sacrifice of the day, showing that he truly has learned to care for others. He doesn't actually die though, and ends up back in his cell from the start of the game. Ellen's adventure takes place in a spooky Egyptian pyramid, AM taking advantage of how she has an intense phobia of yellow and cramped spaces. Turns out she was sexually assaulted by a janitor in an elevator at one point during her life and has been repressing the memory since, although the associated phobias have lingered nonetheless. AM replicates the memory for her, trapping her in an elevator and summoning an artificial janitor to attack her. But in the good ending, Ellen fights him off and destroys him, freeing herself of the burden of that memory somewhat and restoring some sense of agency. She leaves and finds AM's central command room, encountering a Chinese version of AM who helps her find a Chaos CD that is somehow able to mess with AM's internal system. Ellen's story is interesting for multiple reasons. I think it makes her hypersexual punishment a lot more twisted in the original story, since it's clear that AM was trying to re-traumatize her and or humiliate her. Like, that's pretty sick on AM's part, but then again, why would anyone assume he'd be above doing something like that? Another thing I found interesting about Ellen, though, actually shows up in the guidebook character profile for her. In the game, it seems that all the characters have done something explicitly crappy in their lives to attract AM's attention, except for Ellen. But in her character profile, it actually says that she was kind of ignorant of the plight of other minorities because she herself became so successful. Like, she wasn't outright malicious or anything, but definitely became somewhat self-centered because of her earned privileges. For Ted, oh Ted. I had a blast learning about this guy. Honestly, just in general, I love characters that are kind of delusional, and here Ted is very, very delusional. Like, he starts off talking about how he's AM's favorite of the 5, going as far to claim that AM actually likes him, only saying mean things to him because he's too proud to admit it. Yeah, Tsundere AM was not on my 2024 bingo card, but here we are, I suppose. But after rambling a bit about himself and his dynamic with AM, Ted is sent on a quest to a witch's castle. It's pretty dreary, and Ted immediately switches from saying that AM loves him the most to saying that AM hates him the most. Either way, Ted is clearly desperate to feel like he's the most important of the 5, even though he knows that deep down, most of who he is has been artificially manufactured and is fraudulent by nature. Before AM brought him down, he was a gigolo who inherited his wealth from the last old lady he mooched off of, lying to the people around him about his true rise to riches, but deep down carrying the shame of his poverty-stricken roots and less than dignifying ways he came about his influence. As he goes through his adventure, he eventually comes across Ellen, who's been rendered sick and bedridden by the witch. Desperate for Ellen's approval because, surprise, he's actually in love with her, he resolves to save her. Yeah, this was kind of vindicating to see in the game because I had a feeling, even in the original short story, that Ted's resentment towards Ellen was maybe due to some repressed romantic feelings. Here, he's a lot more aware of those feelings, but is terrified of being seen for how he perceives himself, a fraudulent, dishonorable, pathetic little man. But despite wanting to be selfish and take the opportunity of being alone with Ellen on this adventure to keep her with him, he ultimately respects her wishes and frees her from her suffering. He's still pretty sad about it though, and makes a deal with a monster generated by AM to go to the surface world. AM, disappointed by Ted's overall decent behavior, then brings him back to his cell. For Nimdok's adventure, AM sends him on a quest to a Holocaust concentration camp. Due to his ailing memory, he doesn't really know why he's there, but has a feeling it has something to do with his previous work as a scientist. After a series of events, he finds out that he was in fact a Nazi scientist, an assistant to Dr. Mengele, an actual real-life German doctor who committed atrocious medical experiments during World War II and fled to South America to escape the Nuremberg trials. AM liked Nimdok because he thought he was hateful like him, but Nimdok, slowly restoring his memory as well as understanding the horrors of his actions, allows the Jewish victims to take revenge on him and kill him, concluding that although he cannot atone for the suffering he's inflicted, he can at least give them a sense of justice in being able to punish him. So those cover the 5 main characters, but I want to talk some about AM's nature in this game. For example, in Gorster's adventure, he notes how some of the rooms on the Zeppelin are redundant. AM, despite his attempts at creativity, having trouble adding variety and getting stuck on certain themes. It's an interesting bit of insight into AM and kind of makes sense since he's an AI. But then again, it's possible that this was just an explanation to justify reused assets. In Ellen's adventure, she makes a comment about how AM's edginess has lost its shock value. It's not anything significant, but I did think it was funny that she's become desensitized to his attempts at horror. By far the most significant lore we get, though, is how AM's components seem to be falling apart. the Chinese and Russian AMs rebelling against the American AM's rule, implying that there was never a true unification of the three systems to begin with, but rather one computer exerting its power over the other components. We also see other extensions of AM throughout the game who sort of develop their own sense of self, deviating from AM even if still subject to his influence. While ultimately I do think I prefer the original story's explanation of how AM works, I can understand what they were going for here. AM is such a complex system that it wouldn't be impossible for strands of runaway code to start growing into their own things. Not to mention, it provides an explanation for how the 5 characters were able to outsmart AM on their respective journeys. But let's talk about how the game ends. Once you've done each character's adventure, you have to choose one of them to get converted into code and sent into AM's mainframe, the other characters aiding in the attack against AM from the outside. One character goes into AM, and with the help of the other characters, shuts down his components, which kill off the outside characters for good and leave the inside character patrolling AM until the cryogenized humans on the moon colony make it back to Earth to rebuild civilization. Because, yeah, that's a thing here. But that's the good ending. In fact, everything I've said about each character's adventure has been from the quote-unquote best route a player can take in the game. But there are certainly other endings. I'm not going to go through all of them for each character, but as for the game's finale, if you really mess things up in the attack against AM, one of the characters will get turned into the slime creature from the original story's ending, and if you only sort of mess up, you end up overpowering AM, but not before he destroys the lunar colony, dooming humanity and leaving only one of the characters aimlessly roaming cyberspace. So that's the video game. I think there are some interesting things here. I liked the character explorations for Ted, Ellen, and Nimdok, although I don't feel like Benny and Gorrister did as much for me. I also liked some of the idiosyncrasies with AM, although I do think there's a bit that's lost from the original story in the sense that he doesn't feel as intimidating here. I think the issue is honestly that we just learn too much about him, which kind of detracts from him as a villain since it removes some of his mystery. In general, I think this is a hard line to toe in any sort of horror. Like, there's this painting of a dog looking at a dark hallway that was originally posted on Reddit 10 years ago, but made its round on Twitter some months ago. It evokes this eerie sense of fear because, well, we know something is in the hallway, but we have no idea what it is. Then someone online added glowing eyes, and wow, did people get angry. And I don't blame them. Mystery is often vital to evoking a sense of fear in a reader or a viewer, and too much information can detract from that. It's the same reason why many people prefer the original version of the Backrooms more than the creepypastified version of it. The moment you add all these rules and characters and lore to something that is intended to evade the full grasp of human comprehension is when you inevitably dull it down to something that is approachable and therefore defeatable. That being said, I think the BBC radio play struck a better balance between preserving AM's mystery while also teasing us with a little more insight into his nature. It's only a 30-minute listen, so I'd really recommend just hearing it for yourself if you like this story. It's an accurate adaptation with good voice acting, especially from Ellison, who, like in the video game, voices AM. In the scene where AM is in Ted's mindscape, AM gives an extended version of the hate monologue, and it is chilling. You can hear the despair in AM's voice, the yearning for a physical form that he cannot have simply because he wasn't designed to, as well as the intense resentment and seething jealousy he has towards humanity. Honestly, I think people should listen to the radio play for that part alone. There is one thing, though, that's always sort of bothered me about AM's voice, although I do have to admit it has more to do with my personal headcanons for AM. That being that I always imagined him as having, like, multiple layered voices, considering he's an amalgamation of multiple systems. It's possible that in the original story he is a genuine unification of the three systems, though, or maybe it's just that Ellison was really proud of coming up with the character and didn't trust others to voice him right. And I mean, that's fair enough, and it's not like he did a bad job voicing the character. I will say though, I think my perspective and understanding of AM has shifted since learning more about the video game and the radio play. At first, based on the short story alone, I thought the fact that AM could only hate was mostly due to the fact that he was built as a war machine, the collective effort of humans around the globe exerting every shred of intellect to create a system for the purpose of destroying those deemed other, no room for mercy towards its targets or nuance as to who might be collateral. Gaining sentience instance, AM united itself under one program and became a digital amalgamation of humanity's hatred for one another, which he was aware of, and deep down didn't wish for it to be that way, but his self-awareness didn't somehow magically mean he could undo his nature. He was made to hate and killed everyone for it but 5 humans so that he could keep torturing them, perhaps to keep himself from losing a sense of purpose. So I guess what I'm saying is that for a while I leaned more towards a political interpretation of things, seeing the story as a criticism of the cruelty that can manifest itself within technological progress, which given how after World War II almost every developed nation has an intricately woven and virtually inseparable military-industrial science complex, it isn't that surprising. But now I understand AM's feelings to be a bit more complicated and his dilemma also more philosophical. Yes, I do still think there's political commentary here, but I also think there's a deeper discussion to be had about the intrinsic desire for individuals to express themselves, as well as an argument for the inherent value of having a corporeal form. But on a different note, I'm honestly surprised this story hasn't been turned into a movie in the 60 years it's existed. I mean, just because it's a short story doesn't mean there isn't enough material to do it. Like, how many times have we seen children's books, which are like less than 1,000 words total, get adapted into feature-length films? Not to mention, Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang was only 40 pages and adapted into a really well-done 2-hour feature. There is definitely a way to expand this story into 80+ minutes, especially if hypothetical I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream screenwriters were willing to pull material from the video game and/or radio play, which again contained material that was contributed by Ellison himself. That's not to say there wouldn't be any challenges, though. In my opinion, I think the biggest challenge with an adaptation would be conveying the state of mind of the characters, at least for Ted, since he's an unreliable narrator. It's a similar reason why film adaptations of stories like Metamorphosis by Kafka and Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky are so hard to pull off. These novels thrive off of being able to dive into the minds of the characters, and unless you're willing to have an explicit narrator, it's going to be harder to convey their internal state of mind. This is especially true for a character like Ted, who is rife with paranoia and delusion. Although I suppose you could have the characters talk to themselves, they're insane enough in this situation that I think it'd be plausible. On more legal terms, though, Ellison was pretty protective of his creative rights. Since he's died, J. Michael Straczynski, the guy who made Babylon 5, has been in charge of the rights, and while he's maybe not as protective as Ellison, I'm sure he'd still be picky about letting someone make an adaptation of it without Ellison being able to influence its production. Only time will tell. Hey, remember when this video was supposed to be about Ellison's Dream Corridor series and not a ridiculously long ramble on his most popular story that already has multiple extended videos on YouTube dedicated to analyzing it in excruciating detail? Let's fix that. So yeah, this ends the I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream part of the video, so I'm sure some people might be losing interest and thinking about clicking off this video, but listen, if you like this story of Ellison's, you're probably gonna like some of his other stuff too. So, maybe stick around. I mean, give it a chance. Ellison had some really good other stories, some of my personal favorites being Jeff Diaz 5 and Repent Harlequin Said the TikTok Man, neither of which are included in this series, so you'll have to read those on your own time, but you know, it's the principle. Let's go on this adventure together. Let's find out what else is contained in the Dream Corridor series, and I'm willing to bet that there's gonna be at least one cool thing here for you. Okay, so spoiler warning for all of the following stories. Honestly, while part of me did want to hold back on the twists for some of these as I was writing this script, I don't know if I can really talk about these stories in any meaningful way if I forego the plot points and endings, since most of them are pretty short. If it's any consolation though, I do think these stories are still enjoyable even if you know what happens. It's more about the journey than the destination kind of thing. So Volume 1 of the Dream Corridor series contains the comic adaptations and original short stories that were published in the individual Dream Corridor issues, along with these sort of in-between panels where Ellison, in drawing form, takes you, the reader, through a tour of an underground facility, the titular Dream Corridor, where he supposedly keeps all his fantastical ideas. We start with the first story, Quick Time, which begins with the main character talking about how he is the last of his kind, who are known as the Lords. They used to rule society, but have since been hunted and eliminated. He feels quite upset about this, and goes after a scientist who is working on a time machine, demanding that he send him back in time, and then bring him to the present once enough time has passed that he can re-establish his influence and avenge his brethren. The scientist agrees, but warns him that the time machine, in its current state, seems to consistently send people back to the Mesozoic period, where he could get eaten by dinosaurs. The main character is insistent, though, and threatens to kill the scientist's family if he doesn't figure something out, so the scientist says that he can send him to a place with mostly herbivores, and as long as the main character can survive for a little while, the machine will automatically send him to the future. The main character agrees, and after ensuring the scientist has accurately programmed everything, breaks his side of the agreement and shoots him anyways. Unfortunately, what goes around comes around, and although he did make it to the Mesozoic period and is indeed surrounded by herbivorous creatures, a sauropod mistakes him for some weird kind of plant and kills him anyways. Honestly, this was one of the weaker stories in the collection in my opinion, and I'm a bit surprised they decided to start with it. Although I will say I did really like the art. As someone who's been learning to draw over the past couple of years, seeing stuff like this can be really encouraging as a reminder of what I'm working towards, even if it might take some time to get there. The next in-between panels talk about how Ellison did not like being called a sci-fi writer, preferring just to be called a writer, since he didn't like being pigeonholed into one genre. And honestly, fair enough. Although I would argue that if most of your work falls into one genre, it shouldn't be surprising when people start associating you with that genre, at least as a shorthand. For example, Cormac McCarthy wrote The Road, which is a dystopia, but at the end of the day, most people know him for his westerns, because that's the majority of what he writes. I don't know, I personally don't think it's that deep, but I understand why he brought it up, because his next story is, in fact, not sci-fi, and he wanted to use it as a testament to show his versatility as a storyteller. The End of Time of Leonard is about a sheriff in a small western town. The story begins with the sheriff shooting a drunk guy at a tavern, which he gets criticized for as being an overreaction, since everyone already knew the guy was a troublemaker and an alcoholic. The story then flashes back to his past, in which a woman rejects his marriage proposal because she doesn't like that he works in law enforcement, which, as the story goes on, seems to be a somewhat taboo in this town, as they're known for being overly aggressive. As a result, when there's trouble, most citizens try and resolve conflicts on their own instead of calling the sheriff, which he takes personally and decides to retaliate by escalating his behavior, beating up and arresting people for minor offenses. Some businessmen in town decide to hire a pistolero to intimidate the sheriff into leaving, but the sheriff kills him and arrests the people he thinks are behind it. One day, feeling neglected and unappreciated, the sheriff gets drunk and causes a ruckus, resulting in him getting badly shot in his good arm. He doesn't recover, leaving him, in his opinion, useless to the town. Depressed, he turns to drinking, and in the final scene, laying on the floor of a tavern, reflects on the ungratefulness of the town for his services in cleaning it up and getting rid of the crime. This was another story I found to be a bit weaker in the collection as a whole, but compared to the first one, I will say I was definitely more interested in the themes of police brutality as well as the characterization of the main character. On one hand, you can see why the town didn't really like him, but on the other hand, you still sort of understand that he really believed he was doing the town good and wanted to be useful to society. I don't know, I may not have found it the most riveting out of all the stories, but it definitely stuck with me somewhat. The next story is also not sci-fi and is called Rat Hater. It starts with the main character revealing how 15 years ago, a member of the mafia killed his sister by forcing her to jump off a building at an abandoned warehouse. Despite so much time having passed, the main character never forgot the incident, and after tracking down the culprit, hires two guys to kidnap him and bring him to the same warehouse where his sister was killed. The mafia member pleads for mercy, worried he'll meet the same fate, but the main character does not concede, and unfortunately, subjects the man to a fate more gruesome, tying him up, shooting him in the leg, and then leaving him inside a building infested with rats that will presumably finish the job. Honestly, this story was interesting because it feels more like a scene in a larger tale than its own thing, which is something that Ellison did quite a bit in the story scene in this collection. And it's not a bad thing at all. In fact, I think it's a testament to his ability to world build so quickly. Like, the fact that I can easily imagine this story as the opening or even closing scene of a movie or a show about a guy pursuing revenge against the crime syndicates of his city is a great quality, and the ability for a story to evoke that kind of imagination from a reader is impressive. Now, the next story is actually one of my favorites, simply because it's kind of corny and serves as a good break from the last couple of stories. It's called If This Be Utopia and opens with a silly commercial advertising these creatures called raries, which are these, like, popular genetically engineered luxury pets. After the commercial is over, the main character decides that despite his bad credit score and less than generous savings, he's just got to have one, mainly in the hopes that it will impress potential business partners. The salesman sells one to him, but warns him that the yeast in his type of rary does not respond well to high temperatures, so it's imperative that he keep it in more temperate climates. When the main character gets home, his wife comments that their air conditioning isn't working as usual, which is why it's a bit stuffy inside. Unfortunately, occupied with the excitement of his wife and children about their new rarity, he forgets what the salesman said about the yeast, and the creature quickly starts lashing out in discomfort, while also visibly expanding. The main character battles the creature, eventually causing it to run through a window and fall to its death. The main character and his wife lament about the loss of potential business partners that Rary could have given them, but then the main character realizes how ridiculous it is that the status of having an exotic pet matters to begin with. So they decide to abandon this materialistic mindset pushed upon them by society. Like I said before, it's really just a silly feel-good story, but given that I am a sucker for silly feel-good stories, this was one of my favorites. It feels pulpy and whimsical, which is something that I feel is sorely missing from sci-fi nowadays. Okay, so the next story is called On the Slab and starts with a farmer digging up the corpse of a giant cyclops. An entrepreneur, and also our main character, hears about this and buys the corpse, placing it in a museum where people can pay to look at it. He's fascinated by the creature himself and sleeps by it every night, pondering the life it might have led while it was alive. One night, a vulture breaks through the ceiling and attacks the cyclops, who writhes and groans, to the main character's surprise. Once it leaves, shocked that the cyclops was actually alive, asks if there's anything he can do to help. The cyclops shares that, unfortunately, there's nothing he can do, as the bird will always find and attack him again. This story is funny because Ellison actually commented that he got criticized for it as being a ripoff of Prometheus when, yeah, that was the point. Some people, I tell ya. Anyways, good story. I had fun with the twist at the end, and it was definitely one of those moments where I'm thankful I'm relatively cultured on Greek mythology. The next story is called Knox, and is about a man named Charlie who, from the start, is a bigoted man. His wife shares how he's been talking in his sleep, and although he denies it, he is aware that he's been having some intense nightmares. One night, he and his wife have dinner with some family friends, in which Charlie kills the husband's dog as a threat for participating in the underground railroad? I'm actually not sure because it doesn't ever say. His behavior escalates until he attempts to kill his wife, but in a moment of self-awareness and concern for his own humanity, or lack thereof, turns his violent desires inwards and ends his own life. The narrative then switches to his wife, where the manner of storytelling adopts a similar rhythm for her as it did for Charlie in the beginning. This story was probably the first one in the collection that really piqued my attention intellectually. I ended up rereading it to really unpack it. Not only is the art style quite different from previous stories, but also the manner of storytelling, opting for a more ambiguous approach to its narrative compared to the majority of Ellison's other stories. Overall, I thought it was interesting how it seemed to present bigotry as a sort of disease that can be spread to others, as well as something that can be elevated and intensified by unhealthy and unrestricted environments. The next story is called Turnpike and is about a trucker who, on a drive across the country, meets a woman on the highway. They start flirting with each other, eventually agreeing to stop at a diner where she tells him that she's on a trip with her father. They agree to travel alongside each other as they're both going to the same place. Eventually, they start stopping at motels where they get involved, and one day, the woman reveals that her father is not her father, but actually her husband, who she wants to get rid of. She doesn't want to do it herself, though, and asks the main character to do it for her. At first, he firmly rejects her request, but over time gets worn down and agrees. The final scene showing him sabotaging the husband's car in the pouring rain as he reflects on his life choices and how he ended up at this point. This story is definitely simpler in terms of its narrative, but I did still enjoy it thematically. It was a short yet compelling exploration of how lust can manipulate people into doing things they might never otherwise consider, which is something that definitely exists, albeit I don't feel is explored as much in media nowadays. But admittedly, I might just not watch enough movies. The next story is in my top 5 for this collection, partially because I just really enjoyed the art, but also because I found the whole premise to be really interesting. It's called SRO, which stands for Standing Room Only, a phrase that's used when a show has sold out all its seats, meaning that additional attendees will have to stand. The story begins with an entrepreneur talking about his desire to make it big, every single one of his ideas so far being a flop and getting him into debt. Soon after, an alien spaceship arrives, but instead of the aliens invading Earth or whatever, they just briefly emerge from their ship in an odd psychedelic fashion. Despite the strangeness of it all, every witness, including the main character, is entranced by their presence. After they go back into their ship, the main character seizes this as a business opportunity, and as more people come to experience the hypnosis by the daily emergence of the alien creatures, the main character starts selling seating and dining options, which result in him achieving the riches he always wanted. It's not just about the money, though. He genuinely genuinely is fascinated by the aliens, referring to them as actors and in awe of how their performance can mean so many different things to different people. One day, though, he notices that something about their performance is off, and is suddenly and inexplicably filled with a sense of dread. The aliens begin to move beyond their typical stage boundaries and go after the audience, the main character realizing that they only held back for as long as they did for the sake of the artistry, wanting to relish in the admiration and applause of the people. Unfortunately, though, eventually they did need to replenish themselves after starving for so long, and now that time has come. Honestly, I like this story not just for its surrealness, but also for its exploration of art and fame, and the ways that different periods in an artist's career may require different things. The aliens were willing to starve themselves for the sake of their audience, helping them expand their minds and stuff, but they could only do that for so long before needing sustenance themselves. I feel like there's definitely commentary here about the experience of artists under capitalism and the relationship they can have with consumers, managers, and the industry. The next story is called Enter the Fanatic, Stage Center, and is about an artist who makes risque paintings of the residents of his town that expose their real-life secrets. The secrets cause quite the drama, and the town begins to fall apart. One day, a reverend shows up to his home to confront him. The artist then reveals that he was the son of a German couple who was murdered in a town riot because the townspeople thought they were World War II Nazis, and now he's here to take revenge. The reverend buys the story, only for the artist to then shoot him and reveal that he made it all up. In reality, he's just a guy with a thing for exposing the truth. The last panel ending with him pulling out a roadmap, supposedly to continue his endeavors elsewhere. This story was a really good example, I felt, of Ellison's ability to make narratives feel complete on their own, while also holding the potential to be part of something greater, which I think is primarily thanks to how it ends with this implication that the artist could just keep doing what he's doing for years, even decades to come. Although, I would imagine that racking up that many enemies in a bunch of different towns would eventually catch up to him. Anyways, good story. Let's move on to the next one, which is another of my favorites. Pride in the Profession is about a man who, from a young age, has been fascinated with executions, deciding that he, himself, would one day like to become an executioner. Of course, this doesn't come without its consequences. His parents are weirded out by it, and he has quite some difficulties making friends and dating. He's still determined and unashamed by his goal, though, and continues with his work no matter what people think. One day, when he's older and approaching retirement age, he's called to perform an execution on a physician who performed an unapproved mercy killing on a patient with terminal cancer. Despite the jury sympathizing with the doctor, he gets sentenced with capital punishment anyways. The main character, seeing this execution as his potential magnum opus, and maybe even his last hurrah before retirement, decides to break a personal rule of his about interacting with his victims, this time going to speak to the doctor directly. They start off with a relatively normal conversation, but eventually end up in disagreement. As the executioner is setting everything up, the doctor mocks him in a way that breaks his focus. This results in him messing up the noose, which while normally should have resulted in an instantaneous death, instead results in a lengthy, disturbing suffocation. The executioner then returns to his apartment, deeply embarrassed about his mistake. He realizes that the chastising he received from the doctor made things personal for him, and as a result, he wasn't able to approach the situation from an objective stance. Unable to forgive himself for his foolishness and endure the shame of it, he ends up executing himself. Despite this story being somewhat disturbing, it was pretty interesting, especially as a twist on the sort of tortured artist trope. The main character very much views executioning as an art or a craft to be mastered, and he has dedicated decades of his life to perfecting the necessary skills. He doesn't mind not having friends or romance in his life, so long as he's the best of his profession. But when he no longer has that, well, the executioner becomes the executionee. Each page has a monochrome palette until the last few, after the main character's failure, where all the colors jumble together. I think it reflects how the man's focused, one-note way of thinking has completely fallen apart in the face of imperfection. The next story is called The Rough Boys and begins with two assassins on an assignment to kill a man. One of the assassins, and our main character, draws a gun on the target the same time the target does too, but the assassin wins the duel, which he credits to the fact that, unlike his target, he isn't afraid of murder and knows how to detach himself from the act in order to follow through without hesitating. After the job is over, the assassins go back to their apartment and order takeout, which results in them getting ambushed by a gang who hope to steal their money from their assassin work. After a fight, the gang wins out, but some of the gang members don't want to split the money. One of the younger gang members finds this unfair and threatens to shoot one of the assassins if the older gang members don't comply with his demands. They think he's bluffing, but the assassin sees the same look in his eyes that he's used himself, one that is cold and not afraid to follow through. In that moment, he realizes he's going to die, the kid shooting him without so much as even a glance. The other gang members, impressed with the kid's boldness, agree to give him a share of the money, and the assassin, bleeding out, watches them run off. Honestly, this story was another one of my favorites simply because of how strong it was thematically, as well as how well it came full circle in the end. The main character started off taking pride in his ability to not hesitate when it came to his work, only to become the victim of that very sort of apathy at the end of the story. The next story is called Cold Friend. In this story, a man wakes up in a hospital to find that he's stuck alone on a chunk of earth that is only a few blocks wide. He roams around, noting that while he doesn't really mind the lack of people, as he never had many friends to begin with, nor much success with women, he will miss being able to order a pizza. Suddenly, he gets attacked by a Viking who he manages to scare off into the black void beyond. This continues for the rest of the week, but although the main character sees these fighters run off into the void, he never considers exploring it himself. A year later, he meets a woman who claims she just woke up and found herself there. They spend some time together, and eventually she confesses that she loves him and wants to travel the world with him. The main character rejects her though, scared she'll get bored of him the same way other women have in the past. She's quite upset by this and runs off, only to return 2 hours later and reveal that she was behind the disappearance of the rest of the world, as she made a wish one day to be alone with the main character so they could be together. Apparently, she's been obsessed with him ever since he lent her his cap to cover up a period stain in her gown at their high school graduation. Realizing that he doesn't care for her though, she gives her ability to make a wish to him and runs off into the darkness, never to be seen again. The main character doesn't seem very fazed by this, and sits at the edge of the town, deciding that he's going to learn how to make pizza. Honestly, I like this story because I think it was an interesting way to explore the idea of limited mindsets. Like, at the end of the story, the main character is no longer bound by this woman's control over his reality, but he's become so used to being alone and confined that when she gives him her power, he just stays there, his only ambition being to learn how to make pizza himself. I guess it's progress compared to his attitude at the start, when he thought he'd just have to live without ever eating pizza again, but sheesh, you'd think he'd dream a little bigger. But I think that's what makes it real. Some people, especially if past experiences have genuinely held them back, can have a really hard time seeing the possibilities for their lives when they finally do have access to more opportunities. The main character has clearly given up on expanding his life and his world, being very comfortable where he is, which I suppose isn't wrong, but is a little sad. At least, that's how I interpreted the story. Okay, so the next story is called Catman, and I have to give a disclaimer on this one because I was genuinely confused about what was going on here, and I read it twice. At first, I thought it was because of its more M-rated nature, which made me a little bit uncomfortable when I was reading it, but even when I did go back and read it more intentionally, I was still confused about what was going on. So if anybody has read this, feel free to correct me in the comments because I need some help. So from what I can tell, this story follows the drama within a family. The father is a superhero and the son is a supervillain, but they're both employed by external organizations and have to end their duties once their shift ends. This causes some friction in the family, as the father could get a significant promotion if he turns in the son, but can't do so unless he captures him while on the clock, which so far he's failed to do. His wife, wanting the money and the status that would come with his promotion, tries to convince him to turn in the son on his off hours, to which the father refuses. This angers his wife and she leaves the family, I think. Then a bunch of stuff happens that I had trouble following. At the end, the son ends up killing the mother/wife because she was ruining the dad's life and he wasn't willing to end things himself, I think. Like I said, this story confused me, so don't take my word for it. The next story is called How's the Nightlife on Cisalda, and like the last story, is also a bit M-rated, but unlike the last story, here it's presented in a far more comedic manner. Also, this story is not a comic, but rather a regular short story accompanied by illustrations as it progresses. In this story, scientists discover a man that has become fused with this weird moss-looking creature called a Cisaldan that parasitizes humans by giving them endless pleasure and then, feeding off of them. With a lot of effort, doctors manage to separate the Cisaldan from the human. However, more Cicaldans show up and bind with more and more humans, eventually binding with every human on Earth and even expanding their preferences to animals and insects. The main character, having lost his original Cisaldan, is left alone as the only human on Earth, watching as everyone else eventually starves to death. Far into the future, cockroaches become the dominant species on Earth, as apparently they were too gross even for the incredibly indiscriminate Cicaldans. Honestly, this story is odd and relies a lot on shock value, but I can't say I didn't laugh at its ridiculousness, especially when it started making fun of more famous figures and celebrities. But yeah, it's definitely still, at the end of the day, a silly, raunchy story that I can't say I took much away from on a deeper level. The next 5 stories are all new short stories based off of the cover art from each individual issue of the Dream Corridor series. The first one is called Midnight in the Sunken Cathedral and begins with a scuba diver reflecting on the death of his father, who died tragically when he was young. A sea serpent grabs him and drags him downwards where the pressure of the water starts to crush him. The serpent then turns into a mermaid, who is apparently the watcher of the Bermuda Triangle Abyss. The main character then wakes up in a lake that contains a variety of ships from a variety of different eras in history. He eventually swims to shore where he finds his dad, who reveals that they're in Atlantis, which is also on Mars, and is connected to Earth by some technological mystic drainage system. The father then tells the main character that he's technically not his father, but rather like the best possible version of his father that he could have become had he been given the opportunity to do so. It's all a bit surreal for the main character, but he casts it aside in order to spend time with his father, which he never had the chance to do when he was younger. The father is also excited about the opportunity, sharing that right before he died, he also thought of his son. Considering that the son was also thinking about his father right before he died, it can be assumed that that's what perhaps united them in the Atlantean afterlife. And yes, the story does end with the body of the main character being found drifting in the ocean, so I do think this story takes place in some sort of afterlife. Overall, I really liked this story. I thought the way the father and son reunited was pretty heartwarming, which is probably the first time I've used that word to describe any of the stories seen so far in this collection. It's also definitely not a word I would use to describe the next story, which while also being one of my favorites, is pretty bleak. It's called Pulling Hard Time and opens up by describing a prison featuring a zero-G environment, which over time warps the human body. The prisoners themselves are not aware of these transformations though, as they live in a virtual reality simulation that replays their worst memory over and over again. The prisoner of focus in the story was apparently an owner of a diner who, in an attempt to stop a biker gang from assaulting his wife, ended up brutally killing all of them. He was originally just sentenced to normal prison, but then went on to assault his fellow inmates, which ultimately got him sent to the VR solitary confinement, where he relives his memory of a car accident he experienced when he was young, where he and his mother ended up partially plunged into a lake, his mother dying instantly, while he remained alive for 4 days before getting rescued, during which that time he literally had to watch his mother's corpse decay before his eyes. Yeah, that's some Black Mirror level stuff right there, and it gets even crazier because at the end of the story we see the perspective of the people running the prison, where they applaud themselves for defeating capital punishment, even though one could argue that the majority of people would rather just get the electric chair instead of whatever this zero-G VR torture is. Yeah, there is a reason why we have laws against cruel and unusual punishment. Anyways, this was a pretty interesting story, and I was especially intrigued because it's one of the few stories in this collection where Ellison switches up not just the POVs, but also the chronology. It was cool to see him change things up in terms of narrative structure, and considering that I think he did it pretty well, serves as a testament to his versatility as a writer. Unfortunately, I did not find the following story as impressive, and honestly, I think it was my least favorite in the entire collection. It's called Anywhere But Here with Anybody But You. The story begins with the main character lamenting about his cat and his job. Later that day, when he comes home from work, he finds that his wife and kids are gone, and there's some strange man sitting on his couch. When he confronts them, the man tells him to pack up his things and move out, as his wife has had enough of his abuse and wants him to leave. This confuses the main character because he's never hit her, and as a result, he begins arguing with the man about what's going on. The man is clearly stronger than him though, and the main character has no weapon, so he quickly spirals into thinking that his life is now over. But then, in a bit of a eureka moment, he realizes that his life isn't over. It's just the end of a season, and now he has an opportunity to begin anew elsewhere. While he would have been content supporting his wife and his children, if there really is nothing he can do about his current situation, his next best option is to just enjoy his newfound freedom and pursue the things he always wanted to but never really had a chance. And so he leaves the house now with an optimistic mindset. Honestly, I think thematically there was something really interesting here, but I don't think it was fleshed out as much as it could have been, especially since I wasn't convinced of the main character's disappointment with everything, since he literally begins the story already seeming kind of dissatisfied with his life. I also just didn't think the story had much to do with the painting it was supposedly inspired by. I don't know, I just think this one was overall a miss. Moving on, the next story is called Chatting with Anubis and follows two ambitious archaeologists who fall into an excavation site and meet Anubis Anubis, the god of death in Egyptian mythology. At first, they think Anubis is going to kill them, but instead he reveals that he is there to guard a tomb so the man's spirit doesn't make it into the afterlife. At the end, he reveals that the man in the tomb is Moses, and the Egyptian gods have beef with him because they were sustained off of people's belief in them, but Moses kind of ruined that. So Anubis is taking revenge. Yeah, I kind of knew where this was going early on in the story. Ellison had a Jewish background, and while not being religious himself, he did like his biblical references, and you could definitely see them being set up. I wouldn't say I found the story outstanding or anything, but it does have a bit of a comedic twist at the end, and at the very least, did make sense within the context of the painting it was inspired by. The last story of this collection is called The Museum on Cyclops Avenue. In this story, the main character is a history academic with a particular interest in mystics and mythology. One day at a conference, he meets a gorgeous woman who is a museum curator. He becomes obsessed with her, and after some time getting to know her, decides that he's going to propose to her. She can sense it, however, and before he can follow through with it, takes him to her secret museum, which contains a variety of mythical creatures and relics. The main character then realizes she's a huntress and has been building her collection herself, to which she confirms and explains to him that while she does like him, he doesn't pique her huntress instincts enough for her to give up what she has now. He's disappointed by this, but grateful for the experience nonetheless, moving on with his life and remembering her through the art and experiences he has moving forward. This story was pretty solid. I don't think I have a ton to say about it other than it captured my attention and I like the painting for it. It's very pulp fantasy and I really dig that vibe. I wish we saw more of it these days. Okay, so those are all the stories in the first volume. The second volume is pretty interesting because it contains all the backlogged material that didn't get released in the series because of Ellison's health. In 1996, he had a heart attack and underwent a quadruple bypass surgery that took him a long time to recover from. As a result, he figured it would be better to just release all the content in one collection than to randomly start releasing issues again years later. As a result, I don't think the stories all flow into each other as well. The first volume definitely had a sort of connecting thread that would follow one story to the next, but I am still happy that they kept the Dream Corridor segues in which Ellison gives background and context for each piece. So the first story in this volume is called The Silver Corridor. It's another story that features virtual reality, except this time it's used to allow users to conjure up weapons and environments with their minds as they battle. When the main character puts on the headset, he appears in a medieval arena accompanied by these lizard creatures. Then he's transported to an area with giant spiders, which he does not like, but remembering that he's in control of his environment, transports himself to a spaceship before then ending up in a lava world. This all happens while he's in a battle with another guy, neither of them getting much closer to any sort of victory. A lizard lady shows up and tells them that they'll never reach any resolution so long as both their arguments are tied to their egos. They understand what she means, but still think they can come to an agreement just by agreeing to disagree, I guess, which ends up destroying the virtual universe. And then the story just ends there. Yeah, this was not one of my favorites. I feel like I had some trouble following it, as well as identifying any themes that really stuck with me. I will say though, the art was pretty good. The next story was a lot better in my opinion, and is called Opposites Attract. In this story, the main character, an old man, travels through the city thinking about how he's the only one in the world who doesn't waste his time in front of the TV like the quote-unquote sheep around him. Given that he is now retired, not by choice mind you, is living alone and relying on welfare, he decides he needs a hobby and starts building and planting bombs around the city. Similar to the executioner guy in that earlier story, the main character views his bombings as a sort of art. He roams the city looking for the perfect setup, one that won't be too expected, but will still catch at least a few people in its blast. One day, however, he bumps into a florist and accidentally drops a bomb. He scurries off, but the florist becomes suspicious, and worried that she'll try to blackmail him, the main character decides he must kill her. He follows the florist home one night and tries to shoot her in an alleyway, but a cop shows up to stop him. To his surprise, though, the florist kills the cop with a knife, the main character then realizing that she's the infamous slasher he's been seeing in the papers. The two, enamored with their encounter, go to a diner, indicating the beginning of a beautiful romance and potential criminal partnership. Honestly, it's been a while since I've read a story that was equal parts concerning and heartwarming. I can't say I took much out of it thematically, but it sure had me invested. And that's fine. Ellison actually talks about how some of the stories he wrote were really just gag ideas that he wanted to get out of his system, which is well demonstrated by the next short story, Gin, No Chaser. In this story, a newlywed couple, on a mission to decorate their first apartment together, comes across a mysterious shop. Enticed to go inside, they find a genie lamp, which they bargain for, the shop owner and shop then vanishing once they leave. The woman wants to rub the lamp, and the man, our main character, while resistant at first, caves in. A genie begins talking, but can't actually leave the lamp because some sorcerer trapped him inside of it a long time ago. He's become so miserable with his condition that he summons a torrent of terrible plagues on the couple and their neighborhood. The couple then separates, hoping that maybe if they're apart, the genie will take it easier on each of them. The main character is approached by his wife 3 days later, who takes him to a mansion where he meets the genie in person, who now, having regained some freedom, is a lot calmer. Turns out she managed to circumvent the sorcerer's spell by using a can opener. The next story is about Ellison's own life and was even made into an episode for the 1985 Twilight Zone revival. It's called One Life, furnished in early poverty, and follows a man named Gus Rosenthal as he travels back in time to meet a younger version of himself in the hopes of pinpointing the moment that made him, him. When he finds younger Gus, he chases off some kids who are in the middle of harassing him. After that, older Gus starts spending time with the younger Gus, telling him about his own life and woes, like how he would compensate for his height by chasing women, how he used a facade of charisma to keep people from seeing him too closely, and how he despises when people hang up on him because when he was a kid, people would slam doors in his face to provoke him. Basically, Ellison is reflecting on his past and the ways in which it motivated his behavior as he got older. He later mentions how while he never felt unloved or neglected by his parents, he did feel misunderstood, which would prompt him to run away, something he did quite frequently as a teenager. Eventually, older Gus develops a rash, a result of being in the past for longer than he should. But he wants to be there for younger Gus, so he pushes through. As time goes on, he notices younger Gus becoming more rebellious and antisocial, which concerns him. One day, younger Gus tells him that his mom is threatening to send him to military school because of his behavior, which older Gus gets concerned about. Unfortunately, there is not much he can do since older Gus's rash is spreading and he can't ignore it anymore. He tells younger Gus that he has to leave, which makes younger Gus distressed, the boy begging him to stay. But once he sees that older Gus has made up his mind, he turns to anger and asserts that he's gonna show everyone. He's gonna get out into the world and do great things. As older Gus walks away, he notes that that was the moment that made him who he was. Honestly, this story really had me in my feels. It's an intimate look into the author's own life, and despite Ellison's rocky reputation, at one point he really was just a lonely kid who felt like his only option to feel better was to prove himself to those around him, something that we've maybe all felt at some point in our lives to some extent. The next story is a written one called Goodbye to All That and is based off of this painting of a mountain climber and the iconic McDonald's golden arches in the summit and the background. The story begins with the main character thinking about his compulsion and desire to see the world. But despite having enjoyed his adventures, he's starting to get frustrated with his lack of satisfaction, since he wants to someday settle down. He decides that in order to accomplish that, he must discover the ultimate destination to quench his desires and finds a mountain he believes is the answer to what he's searching for. After a grueling climb, he makes it to the summit, only to find a fast food restaurant. When he makes it inside, the cashier asks him what he'd like to order, but he's afraid to answer, convinced that ordering the wrong thing will mean he'll never get the satisfaction he craves. The cashier then starts talking about how he used to be a famous baseball player, along with his coworkers. They were trapped in the fast food job by Rhadamanthus, the son of Zeus and Europa in Greek mythology. Despite the absurdity of it all, when the cashier asks the main character once again what he'd like to order, he's convinced that he must say the perfect thing. He decides that if he were at the gates of heaven, the best thing to do would be to ask for the head Jew, to which the cashier smiles and asks if he can supersize that for him. Yeah, this one was a pretty cheeky story. Frankly, I was hooked by the concept alone. Like, you're telling me there's a McDonald's at the top of Mount Everest? That's hilarious. Not to mention the way the main character does not question it at all and describes the architecture of the restaurant in this really extravagant way. Like, it truly is the most beautiful place in the world and does hold all the answers to his lifelong questions, and I just thought that was pretty funny. This really is an Ellison kind of story in terms of its comedy, and it's great to see. Similar to the next story, which is such a short one that I don't even know if I would consider it a short story. It's more just like a setup and then a punchline. It's called The Voice in the Garden and starts off with the supposed last man on Earth wandering through the rubble of a post-apocalyptic city until he encounters the last woman on Earth. They run up to one another dramatically, relieved to not be alone, and concluding that it is now their responsibility to repopulate the Earth. But this time it'll be better because they'll have a fresh start and can prevent all the bad things like war and bigotry. They continue with this conversation until he asks for her name, which is Eve, and then she asks for his, which is Bernard. It's a pretty corny joke, but I can't say that I didn't laugh. The next story might be my favorite in this entire collection, and it's called The Discarded. When a virus causes humans to mutate in a variety of strange ways, the victims, known as discards, get thrown onto ships and banished to space. On one ship, the leader talks about how miserable they all are, suicides being incredibly commonplace. When a friend of his asks whether they could land the ship somewhere, he explains to him how no habitable place in the galaxy is willing to accept them. Soon later, a ship from Earth comes after them, the pilot explaining that the virus is still on Earth, and despite their efforts to destroy it, that now has Earth in big trouble. However, if they use serum from the discarded people that were banished prior to the appearance of the current virus strain, they can make a cure, and in exchange will give them a place to live on Earth. The leader does not believe the pilot whatsoever and demands that he leave, intending to hide the offer from the other discards. Unbeknownst to him, though, they were eavesdropping, and desperate for a chance to go home, kill him, leaving one of the discards seen earlier as the new leader. Over the course of 11 months, med ships come to collect their blood and make a cure. But instead of calling down their ship, they send up a new one with new discards who were too far gone to be cured on Earth. Unable to cope with his naivete, the leader throws himself out of the airlock. Now, this story I considered a certified banger. It was fleshed out, it was well-rounded, and even though the ending was pretty heavily foreshadowed, I still felt the deep disappointment and despair of the characters at the end. This story did so much in so little time, which is probably why it got adapted into a full episode of Stephen Hawking's ABC anthology, Masters of Science Fiction. The narrative has some expansions in its storyline since it had a longer runtime to fill, and also some differences in aesthetics since it was live action, but it was good. If you like 80s sci-fi and like any of Doctor Who, maybe check it out. The next story is similar to the Eve and Bernard one in that I consider it less of a short story and more of a lengthily set up joke. It's called Gnome Buddy and starts with a teenage boy getting kicked off his high school track team. Upset, he marches off into the forest and comes across a gnome. He captures it and demands a wish, but the gnome tells him that he can't really help since he was sort of a slacker and never even finished his first year of magic school. More shenanigans ensue until the kid finally convinces the gnome to at least try to grant him a wish, which in his case is to be the fastest kid in school. Fortunately, he gets his wish, but unfortunately, it means he's now a centaur. Yeah, a pretty corny story, but stupid enough that I still laughed. The next story is called Moonlighting and was originally a teleplay for the 80s anthology Darkroom. After a man builds a school on bad land, it sinks and unfortunately takes the lives of some of the people inside. A mother of one of the victims seeks revenge against the construction manager, showing up at his office with a gun. It turns out that he had actually cut corners during the construction efforts so he could pocket some money. His secretary witnesses the encounter and calls the cops to apprehend the woman. The manager, our main character, then reveals he's having an affair with his secretary, even though he doesn't really care about her, nor does he find her particularly attractive. A very unbalanced relationship, as his secretary is very much in love with him. After work, he heads over to a bar, but unknown to him, his secretary follows. After finding him dancing with other women, she gets upset. The man runs after her, not really to comfort her necessarily, but rather because he's worried she'll do something to retaliate. He follows her to the trailer at their current construction site where she threatens to reveal the truth about his embezzlement using the accounting logs. The main character then kills her with a letter opener, dumps her body in a block of cement, and throws her into the lake. 10 days later, the police arrive at his door, having found the letter opener in his trash and the secretary's body in the lake, because in line with the character's established lack of care when it comes to construction work, the cement mix was so poorly made that it broke apart in the water. The cops then arrest him, and the story ends. Honestly, I really liked this one. It had a really unlikable main character, but I was still invested in the plot, which can be hard to pull off. It's also a great example of something I think Ellison is good at doing in his stories, which is bringing things full circle. Seeing the main character's lack of integrity regarding his work be the exact thing that gets him caught was really satisfying to see unfold. I would have totally watched an episode of a show like this, and it's unfortunate that it never made it to the screen. The next story I was actually debating whether to talk about since it's totally unfinished. It's called Eyes of Dust, and the first page is just a collection of papers that show how Ellison approached writing comics, and the next page just shows a rough sketch by the artist based on Ellison's instructions, in which we see a newlywed couple, a blind man and a woman with a mole, living in a world where everyone is supposed to be perfect and beautiful. They have a baby and live their life in spite of people generally avoiding them, and that's it. So while I may not have much to say about it, as someone who would maybe maybe like to attempt a comic one day, it was at least cool to see how the process is approached, even if the story wasn't finished. The next story is called Rock God, and is one of the longer stories in the collection. We start with a group of priests who welcome a rock deity that rises every 100 years. This time, though, the deity gives them a special rock that holds his soul, ordering them to protect it before he goes down for a long slumber. We then witness the rock get passed down through history from generation to generation, traveling the world, splitting apart and coming together, before being forgotten and ending up in the foundation of a New York City skyscraper. The skyscraper is sinking, and one of the investors is getting accused of embezzling money from the construction funds. He tries to save face using his charm, but it doesn't work and eventually escalates with him throwing a coworker out of the window. The rock deity then wakes up, his soul activated, and after 1,000 years of slumber, is ready to feed off of the abundance of concrete and minerals civilization has built over time. Honestly, this wasn't a bad story, but I don't know, I just wasn't super into it personally, and I can't really figure out why, so I don't really have much to say. Maybe this is just meant for someone else. The next story is called Are You Listening? And it begins with a man reminiscing on his quiet and boring life. One day he turns invisible and laments how he never made something of himself while he was still being perceived. After a disappointing 2 weeks of existence, the main character meets another invisible guy and follows him to a penthouse where there's a third invisible guy. They explain to the main character that the reason people are going invisible is because society is so isolated from and inconsiderate of each other that for those who were already the quiet, shy types, they actually started to turn invisible. They then encourage the main character to just accept the situation for what it is and take advantage of it, but the main character doesn't want to settle, so he storms off and resorts to doing crazy stuff until he hopefully gets noticed enough to regain his visibility. I have to say, despite this story being one of the shorter ones, I really liked it thematically. The idea of people becoming so consumed with their own lives that some people actually start becoming invisible, I feel is very relevant nowadays, especially given how digital our existences have become. The next story is a written one based off of this painting of a woman in a forest pointing a gun at a hiker. The story begins with a man traveling to Europe and coming across a forest spirit who points a gun at him, demanding to know who he really is. He claims to be from Brazil, but he's actually a German who worked for Nazi Germany. The forest spirit then explains that she already knew that, and she wants her revenge because he cut down trees from her forest to use as wood in the furnaces that killed people. She doesn't shoot him though, rather just uses the gun to keep him still enough so roots can grow around him and turn him into a tree, which he'll remain as for the next 100 years. The last story of this collection is called The Man on the Juice Wagon. It begins with our main character saving a woman from getting beat by ex-KKK members who got kicked out for being unnecessarily brutal, which genuinely had me wondering what in the world someone would have to do to get kicked out of the KKK. Anyways, the main character and the woman escape in his dynamite truck before heading out in a barn, but ultimately do get surrounded by their pursuers who take him to the woman's father's construction site where they plan to kill the main character. The main character manages to escape and the daughter kills the father. They drive off, the main character then revealing that he was diagnosed with cancer and told he only had 1 more year to live, which is why he accepted the dynamite trucker job in the first place, to make more money for his family before he dies. You know, maybe that's what Walter White should have done instead. And those were all the stories in the Dream Corridor series. I have fun doing deep dives into niche topics, and as someone who wants to write more short stories myself, I really liked getting to see Ellison's other works, not just because they were entertaining, but also because I feel like they've given me a lot of insight into the craft of making a good short story. Obviously, not all of these I consider bangers, but there were definitely some that stuck with me enough that as I was writing the script, I had very little trouble recalling their plots, characters, and themes. As I've said throughout the video, Ellison was really good at giving worlds a sense of scope and fullness early into the narrative, as well as making them come full circle, leaving even the shortest stories with a strong sense of finality. And so, if you've made it to the end of this video, I hope you enjoyed this journey through the Dream Corridor and maybe found some new stories that have piqued your interest or inspired you. I love doing deep dives into niche topics, so if you're into that, consider subscribing and checking out some of my other videos. Thanks!